λίγες μέρες ζητήσαμε από τον Carlo Masala, είναι καθηγητής Διεθνών Σχέσεων στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Μονάχου και έχει γράψει ένα πολύ ενδιαφέρον βιβλίο, κυκλοφορεί και στα ελληνικά από τις εκδόσεις Μετέχμιο, με τίτλο «Τι θα γίνει αν η Ρωσία κερδίσει» για τον πόλεμο. Έχει πολύ ενδιαφέρον να δούμε τι μας απάντησε, το παρακολουθούμε και αμέσως μετά επιστρέφουμε εδώ στη συζήτησή μας. Professor Masala, a lot has changed since you wrote your book on what could happen if Russia were to win the war. Do you sense that in the presumable future the focus will concentrate on the Middle East now?
Well, yeah, this is what we're seeing since 4 days, that all eyes are basically on the war against Iran. And actually for Russia, this is a good news. For Ukraine, this is a bad news because public opinion as well as, governmental attention is distracted now from Ukraine and geared towards the region of the Persian Gulf.
And Russia might also get advantage of the fact that oil prices will go up.
It's not only that oil prices are going up, it's also that interceptors are running short, because what we see in the Persian Gulf, I mean, with the attacks of Iran on other Arab countries, but as well as with the campaign of the US and Israel against Iran, a lot of interceptors for the Patriots are used now in the Persian Gulf, and there is a shortage of interceptors in Ukraine. So I think if it comes to the choice between, delivering interceptors to Arab countries or to Ukraine, the US will go for the Arab countries, and this is a bad news for Ukraine.
On the Ukraine-Russia front, where do negotiations currently stand?
They are standing actually where they stood already 5 months ago. There are two issues which have not been resolved, and this is the issue of territoriality. I mean, Russia is still demanding of getting the whole Donbas, while Zelensky is tying his willingness to withdraw from the Donbas to security guarantees, hard security guarantees from the US. But so far, there are only theoretical security guarantees by the US. So we didn't progress. And secondly, what we heard recently from Moscow is that actually there is not much willingness to agree on anything, because Moscow still believes that it can win this conflict militarily.
Do you think that Ukraine will ultimately be asked to give up territory?
Well, I mean, this is already the case. Ukraine is asked to give up 20% of the Donbas, the Oblast Donetsk, which is currently still holding. This is a demand by the Russians, which is supported by the Americans. And the Ukrainians are tying this to security guarantees. But the US is very reluctant to give security guarantees to the Ukrainians. But the pressure on Ukraine is mounting. I mean, there is the concern, which I heard from the Ukrainian delegation, which negotiates in Geneva and in other places, that they think that by the end of May, beginning of June, the US will walk out of these negotiations, because Donald Trump doesn't want to go into the midterm elections with this unresolved problem for him.
You write that the goal of European support for Ukraine was never clearly defined. What do you mean by that? Could you explain it?
Well, actually, the Europeans from the very beginning linked their own strategy to the US strategy and followed the US strategy. There is actually no idea what to achieve in Ukraine. The former Chancellor Scholz, he said Ukraine should not lose, Russia should not win. Actually, this is not a strategy. So this is basically a policy which aims at keeping this war ongoing until one side or both are exhausted. But this is not what I would consider a clear-cut strategy for this war.
What would a Russian victory in Ukraine mean for European security?
Well, if you consider Russia as a neo-imperial power, and we have plenty of or ample of evidence that Russia is a neo-imperial power, wants to restructure the European security landscape, a victory in Ukraine would basically fuel the appetite of Russia after a while to pursue its agenda of changing the European security landscape. And thereby they would feel encouraged if they get things they haven't achieved militarily, like the Donbas, for free, to say. This would basically fuel Russia's ambitions to go even further after the end of the war.
And what would further mean in terms of other countries?
Yeah, Russia made it very clear, because they wrote letters in December 2021 to Washington and to NATO's headquarters in Brussels, where they basically said that, American troops should withdraw from Central and Eastern Europe and as well as the Baltics, because the Russian ambition is to dominate politically and economically what they consider the legitimate forefield. And this is what the Russians want to do.
Now, 4 years after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, a Russian victory still remains elusive. Do you believe that Putin will ultimately win this war?
Well, it looks very much like, because Donald Trump more or less sidelined with Russian demands with regard to Ukraine. Because for Donald Trump, the restoration of economic relations between the US and Russia is paramount to a fair deal in Ukraine. And therefore, what we currently are seeing is that actually the US is giving Russia what Russia hasn't achieved militarily.
Overall, do you have a coherent understanding of what the US policy in the Ukraine-Russia war is?
In my understanding, Trump wants to restore the relations with Russia. He wants to normalize the relations with Russia, especially in the economic field. And that's, as I said, is paramount to everything else. So Ukraine is in its way to do this. And therefore, I would always say that Trump has no real interest in the war itself. He has an interest in normalizing relations with Russia. And the war against Ukraine is a hampering block in this regard.
And how do you normalize relations with Russia when Europe as a whole has stopped receiving gas and oil from Russia?
Well, actually, for Trump, it is what is on the table is huge economic cooperation with Russia. The Russians are very clever in offering Trump certain things in the economic realm, like the common exploitation of natural resources in the Arctic, restoring the trade between Russia and the US, which is more important for Russia, of course, than for the US. But the exploitation of natural resources in the Arctic is something the US is very much interested in, and Russia is offering this possibility through joint ventures.
Mm-hmm. Finally, after the US invasion to Iran, we did not see any Russian reaction to that. Do you sense that this tendency will continue?
Yes, this tendency will definitely continue, because there is one thing we see or we could observe over the past months is that Putin does everything not to let Trump become angry on Russia. So whenever you had a situation where Trump was raising some concerns about Russia's ambitions or willingness to negotiate, it was Putin who immediately went close to the US, made an offer just to keep Trump engaged. So helping Iran in one way or the other would basically cause some, let's say, rift in US-Russian relations, and Putin is not willing to risk that.
And finally, with Europe having two fronts in its backyard, Ukraine and the Middle East, are we finally approaching a point where Europe has waken up geopolitically to stand up and try to stand for itself? Or are we still very much away of what we call strategic autonomy?
No, we're very much away from this kind of strategic autonomy. And I think you can see this very clearly with regard to Europe's attitude towards the US and Israel. Chancellor Merz went to Washington yesterday and basically kept silent and supported foolhardily American goals, which are very much unclear with regard to Iran, but the whole process of letting the regime collapse. So we are far away from strategic autonomy at this point.
Professor Masala, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for your interest.